when we look back in the past, what do we remember of past cultures? We don't remember so much their political squabbles or their business plans. We remember the art and the music and the poetry that they left us. So our only way to create a better world and to keep the world beautiful is through the arts.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Why Music Matters podcast. I'm your host, music journalist and musician Jeff Miers. Throughout my life in and around music, I've often asked myself the question, why does music matter? This podcast will attempt to answer that question with the help of musicians, members of the music industry, and music lovers like you. Today on Why Music Matters, I'll be speaking with JoAnn Falletta, music director of the Buffalo Philharmonic Orchestra. Called one of the finest conductors of her generation by the New York Times, Maestro Falletta is the first woman to be appointed music director of a major American ensemble. Throughout the course of her career, she's been a tireless champion of music's ability to transcend cultural and physical boundaries and to speak to our shared humanity. Thanks for joining us on Why Music Matters. I'm sitting here with JoAnn Falletta, Maestro JoAnn Falletta, music director of the Buffalo Philharmonic Orchestra, among many other things, but here in Buffalo, we know and love you for that. And my friend, it's good to see you again.
It's good to see you too, Jeff. And we have been good friends for a long time
We have.
here, and just trying to sort of take care of the music scene here
Right.
together, and
Yeah, navigate
yeah,
these kind of changing
changes.
times. You've just come back from Brazil,
Yes.
and this leads nicely into the topic of this podcast, Why Music Matters, is purposely kind of broad. But I think by asking that question, we can get to the core of what makes us pursue this life, what makes us, and, there's no question of leaving it. Once we're in it, we're in it.
That's right.
But, why music matters and how it can be so transformative to us individually and also as a culture, as a society. And with your traveling, which has been extensive, and working with different orchestras in so many places in the world, all over our country, but in so many other places in the world, I think you have a unique perspective on how music can cross all these borders, that its power can cross cultural and physical borders. So I'm wondering, at the core, are people who might not have much else in common reacting to music in a similar way, meaning both the orchestra and the audience?
That is absolutely true, and I can say that with a lot of experience of being in places where I couldn't even speak the language. I remember my first time in the mainland China orchestras in Beijing and Shanghai, and realizing that we were all the same.
Mhm.
Now, Jeff, these were people who lived very different lives from you and I, and grew
Yeah.
up in very different a way and lived in a very different situation. But when we were working on Tchaikovsky or
Mhm.
Beethoven, or even an American piece, we understood that language. We were all the same. I began to joke about it that musicians or artists have the same DNA
Yeah.
because they understand things even when they can't understand the words you're saying. And I noticed that orchestras reacted to the same places in the music. They'd all struggle over the same parts. The parts that the Buffalo Philharmonic found challenging, the orchestra in Beijing found the same thing challenging, or in Sao Paulo, the places where you could tell how moved they were by the music were the same. And these are people who didn't have a word in common with each other. So I began to realize that music is something that we are hardwired for. We
Mm.
understand it, even though we might not be able to put it into words. And it sounds like a truism to say that music is the international language, but having seen it with my own eyes, and heard orchestras respond in the same way, and seen young people from all around the world come together in a festival, again, not being able to communicate with each other and becoming wonderful friends over the course of 6 weeks together. It is so powerful. I mean, is the arts are the most powerful thing we have, and when we look back in the past, what do we remember of past cultures? We don't remember so much their political squabbles or their business plans. We remember the art and the music and the poetry that they left us. So um, our only way to create a better world and to keep the world beautiful is through the arts.
I couldn't agree more, and that was just incredibly well said. We've talked a lot in the past, you and I, about, and this is more particular to the BPO and your role specifically here as music director. Um, we've talked about how important it is to send this message and back this message up that this is the people's orchestra, that the music and the community aspect of that are so central to what you've tried to do. This became really apparent after May 14th tragedy when the orchestra's outreach to the community, the back and forth really felt like
Yeah,
this seamless
yeah.
kind of coming together. Can you talk a bit about that experience, but also all of your experience um, about music's capacity to heal,
Yes,
um,
yes.
both individually, but also as a community and a culture?
It has tremendous, tremendous power to heal. And when that happened here in Buffalo, I think after our shared disbelief that this could happen in our city, it's a city of good neighbors, a city of people who took care of each other, who were proud to be
Yeah,
Buffalonians, and loved the good and bad things about our weather, and it was heartbreaking. And everyone reached out, and we reached out with the voice that we had, that we played pieces that we thought could heal. And we spoke to the community at that point, and we said, we want to be here with you. And
yeah,
and they told us, they said, right now it's too painful for us, but can you come back with the orchestra in a few months and play for us? And we did that. And now that's developed into an annual event
yeah.
where we go to the Johnny B. Wiley Pavilion and perform pieces for the community that we love, and that is really not far from us at all. But we wanted to be on that ground, on
Yeah.
that but really sacred ground, and remembering those people, and it's become now from originally being called a concert for healing to a concert for unity, and I
Mhm.
think that makes so much sense. And people listening to music respond with emotions that they didn't even know they had. For instance, so many people tell me, I was listening to the orchestra playing and I started to cry. And
Yeah.
I wasn't I wasn't sad, but I just had that reaction to it. Or leaving a concert hall and feeling uplifted by something, feeling that yes, something could happen. Yes,
Yeah.
could be optimistic about this. So it's hard to put those things into words. Someday, maybe scientists will be able to tell us exactly how music affects our brains. But we know, and you know this just
Mhm.
as well as I do, Jeff, music does something good in the brain, and it
Yeah.
lights up the entire brain, and it speaks to us all in an individual way, which is really quite astonishing.
Very true. And then hopefully that being spoken to or feeling those deep feelings on an individual level can then become something that's experienced on a more community or communal level
That's
with
right. That's
others,
right.
because we all know this, whether you've been, conducting or listening to music, you feel connection with the people that you're experiencing that music with in real time, even if you are wildly divergent people with maybe radically different beliefs
That's right.
for
It's
that
that's why
moment.
coming into a concert hall, I think, is so important. Now, we all love music in any way we can
Yes.
hear it, but during the pandemic, we weren't able to do that in that way. I mean, coming into a place and listening together, I think that's rather amazing. We sit
Mhm.
in relative silence. I mean, we're not speaking. We're showing our appreciation, but we're not really speaking. and we are all hearing it in our own way with our own background and our own knowledge or innocence towards music,
Right.
and we're all moved, and there is something about being in that space together. I guess it's like watching a football game together. It's
Sure.
so much more fun. It's so much more meaningful. Music is the same way. So being together, when we finally did start to come back after the pandemic, very slowly, as you know, Jeff,
Yes.
well, first 50 people in the audience all spread out, then a couple of hundred, and finally now with a full house for Yo-Yo Ma. It's it makes you realize that that communal enjoyment of it, that communal sense of being together, it's almost sacred in a non-denominational way,
Right.
but it's sacred to people's experience of beauty and communication in a wordless sense, which is
Mm,
amazing.
it's a beautiful answer. Um, One of the challenges that we have to face as a culture is the ability to balance the significance of history against the demands of the present and our possible paths, to the future. So we've seen in this country that many will attempt to erase or modify history when it suits their agenda to do so, which is a sign of a culture maybe not at its healthiest.
Yeah.
But you told me once that this is a quote from one of our discussions: orchestras are not a museum. An orchestra is a living entity in today's world. So I'm wondering, how are you able to balance the weight of history against the need to exist fully in the present? And what can that teach all of us as a culture wrestling to define ourselves? That
That
battle that
balance.
you're doing.
Well, composers for the last 3 centuries have responded to their present
Yeah.
by writing music. It didn't come out of some pristine image of the world. It came out of how they were living it.
Yeah. Struggle
The
often.
struggle, the struggle. So, I think I've told you before, the time of music I find the most personally interesting is the early 20th century,
Mm,
because the world was changing in such frightening ways, in such fantastic ways. I mean, new possibilities, new discoveries, but also fear.
mm,
And composers are not immune to that. They're living in the world, and people like Bartok and Stravinsky and Mahler responded with the whole fiber of their being, and reflected fear,
yeah.
reflected confusion. So I always think that when we listen to music from different times, we actually understand more about that time than if we read a history book. We understand more,
Yeah.
so that doesn't exist in a vacuum. I mean, we have a museum, but it's almost like a historical museum of people's feelings and people's reactions,
Right.
and that takes us up to the 21st century. I mean, the music that's being written right now, that reflects our worry about our earth, our ecology, that reflects the hope of bringing people together to understand that we're all the same, and so it's all about history, and it's about true history, because
Right.
these composers are not revising history; they're living it. So I think it's a continuum is how I
Yeah.
really think about it. It's not that we play music from the past because it was just beautiful. It takes us from that time, from really back in with orchestras, at least back into the 17th and 18th century,
Yeah.
into the 21st century, and I'm doing a piece next week, written by a composer who has written a triple concerto, which is a very old form for violin, cello, piano, and orchestra.
Incredibly
But
ambitious.
yes, but writing it about the sense of our world and what's happening to our world and the danger of what we're doing to the earth. But at the end, the hope that we can care for
Mm.
for for our beautiful planet. So he's writing in an older form, but writing about what's happening now.
Yes, that continuum and the idea that music is timeless, the best music
It is.
always.
It is. It's timeless, and that's why I think, we should use the word classic for music,
Right.
not in the sense of classical as opposed to popular,
Right.
but just classic in a way that we'll always love it, and we'll always need it, and we'll always understand it.
Very well said. um, I, I'm always looking for the sort of metaphorical implications of how what we just discussed, a way to acknowledge, be schooled in, and venerate and celebrate history, um, first by acknowledging and owning it, but not being trapped by it, by realizing that it's an evolving thing, just that includes a continuum to brand new
That's
music.
right.
Um, I feel like there's just a lesson there for the broader society, how to how to acknowledge even the difficult things in our collective past
Right.
without being trapped by them, or the danger to try to rearrange them to fit
Right. Well,
something that's not reality. I feel
I,
like music can teach us something
music can
here.
teach us that because I think we have to acknowledge things that have happened. I mean, if, in our world there've been plenty of beauty and plenty of tragedy,
Yeah.
and that's part of living in this world. And music reflects what we've done, what we haven't done, and I think there's a certain joy in going back and rediscovering. During the pandemic, I had a personal project in which I wanted to try and discover as much music that had not come to light in our immediate past, 20th
Mm,
century past, for one reason or another, because it was written by a woman, because it was written by an African American, because it was written by someone who had no access to performances, all kinds of, or written by Jews who couldn't flee, couldn't get out of Germany, and whose careers were stopped, or they were killed. So all kinds of people who didn't have a voice anymore.
mhm.
That voice still existed. We had some music, we had pieces we could play. And in studying these pieces that I didn't know from all directions, I actually felt very joyful because it was like discovering this. It was like bringing something alive again.
Yeah, it's a
Dis-
victory.
it's a victory,
Yeah.
exactly. That's the best word. It's a victory in saying, okay, you didn't get the recognition that you deserve. We can do that now, and in a sense, what would those voices want more than that? Not to be
Mm,
silenced. So I thought it was a fantastic opportunity to hit the pause button, maybe, because even though we were making music, we weren't working at the incredible schedule we had
right.
during that time. For all of us to go back and make discoveries,
Mhm.
so I think our programs now, I know in Buffalo, have become more diverse. They've
Clearly.
become more interesting. They've become more unusual, and the audience is there. They're interested in this, and it's as if we've discovered the iceberg at the bottom, that was hidden all this time. So actually, I find it very joyful. Yes, there's a lot of terrible things that happen, but we can, we can, in our way, try to make up for that, to try
I
and
agree.
rectify that by bringing great music to the public.
Mm. Um, I wanted to talk a little bit about the sort of controlled democracy that is an orchestra, right?
Oh,
Um,
this is interesting.
um, and I feel like an ensemble like an orchestra can be a great metaphor for how democracy can work. And again, I'm looking back at some of the many times we've spoken, and I remember you saying, um, quote, conductors frame and guide musicians, and we create a landscape where they can thrive. I want the piece to belong to each musician and let them inform the piece while not abandoning them as their conductor. It's almost unattainable for each musician to feel that, but I strive to make that happen.
Well,
That's
I'm
just
honored
so
that
cool.
I'm honored that you remember that, Jeff, but that's what it is. Orchestras have a strange reputation from the general public that the conductor is a tyrant
Right.
and is like controlling the orchestra, and it's absolutely not that way. It is a democracy. It's a democracy that flourishes in the most beautiful world, because just think of the composition of the orchestra. All the different instruments. I
Mhm.
mean, all the different backgrounds of people. We have people from all over the world in our orchestra, and they are concentrating on what they're doing, whether they're playing the oboe and worrying about their reed, or playing the double bass, or they bring different gifts to the orchestra. And
But
so
all
how
are essential.
all are essential. Every single individual is essential, and they all have to coordinate and cooperate. So it's the most extraordinary team, and everyone is critical. The conductor has to find a way of establishing that landscape where excellence can flourish.
Mm.
I mean, the team of an orchestra is astonishing when you think about the training that every one of those musicians has had by the time they get to the Buffalo Philharmonic. And most of them start when they're 5 or 6 years old
Yeah,
playing,
they're
and
10,000 hours or more,
that's
right?
right. All the practicing, all the lessons, all of the master classes, all the sacrifices their parents make sure they can do this.
Yes.
Um, and then they come into this orchestra with these gifts. I mean, with this talent. Sometimes I am sort of amazed just to think of the brain activity on that stage, playing through a piece like Don Juan by Richard Strauss, playing through a piece like this. The brain activity, the physical dexterity that they've built up, it's almost frightening to think about. I mean, how talented that group is. So the conductor is someone who is creating a frame where they can be free, and that's so important to me because the music that we see on the page is only a map.
Right.
You know, it doesn't control everything. It comes to life in how the musicians play it, and they can play it differently. Every orchestra should sound different. They should be themselves. So I realized early on that I didn't want a performance of the Virginia Symphony to sound like the Buffalo Philharmonic, to sound like the Sao Paulo Symphony. I wanted it to sound like them because they were individuals with their own musical ideas. They were experts. They were artists, great artists. And that's what's thrilling to me, that they own that piece,
Mhm.
that at any given time, we're following something else. I mean, I'm listening to the clarinet playing that solo, or I'm letting the violas guide us through a difficult rhythmic passage. So it is a democracy that we're passing around all the time, and it's also chamber music in the best sense, where
Right.
we may be 100 people, but we're playing like 4 people sitting next to each other. All of that is, as I said, probably not completely attainable, but that's what the goal is.
And when you reach for it, you get a lot closer than
Yes, absolutely.
that. That's a beautiful answer again. Um, we talked a little about this earlier about music's transformative powers, and many of these transformations happen on an individual basis while we're alone, perhaps reflecting on a recent musical experience or even listening to music by ourselves and feeling something that's like an epiphany. Um, I'm wondering if you could share any of the musical epiphanies or transformative events from your own life in music, if any stand out to you.
Well, there are some that really stand out so strongly. I mean, I remember a time, this was a number of years ago in Buffalo, that we were going through a difficult patch financially in terms of problems that we were having, and every orchestra does that. And I was feeling quite depressed about it, and I was in my car getting ready to drive somewhere, and I put on the radio, and they were playing the slow movement of Beethoven Emperor Concerto. Someone knew I needed that.
Yeah, I love when that happens.
And I listened to this amazing, like, dream of a piece, um, which Beethoven actually wrote in his own score, Torment, meaning dreaming, at the top of it, and he, never did anything like that really, and I just listened. I decided not to drive. I just listened, and the end, I somehow knew that it was going to be okay. That if this was what we could do, it was worth the difficulty. If this was what we could bring to people, that healing that I felt so strongly. And I feel that all the time. For instance, going to Sao Paulo recently, and it's a very long trip, and then going right into an orchestra rehearsal. I'm feeling tired and feeling just really kind of, grumpy and a little bit out of it.
Human.
Yes. And then starting the rehearsal, uh, playing through Debussy La Mer,
Mm.
and at the end of it, I wasn't tired anymore. This happens all the time. I wasn't at the least bit tired. I was exhilarated. I was exultant in a way that we together could play this. Okay, we were going to work on a lot of things, but we played it together, and we said something to each other that we couldn't say in it together. I mean, I didn't speak Portuguese, and they didn't speak English for the most part. So, but we did communicate, and so somehow that music changed my whole sense of reality. And that happens a lot. That happens a lot. And it is transformative. And I think one of the reasons it is so transformative is we don't try to analyze what happens. We
That's
don't know
right.
what happens. But I do know this, people come into the concert at 7:30, after a long week and lots of ups and downs, and maybe a little squabble or whatever. And they sit in their chair and they're feeling one way. And when they leave at 9:30, they're feeling completely different. And they didn't actually do anything to make that happen other than open themselves up
Right.
to listening to the music. They don't know why it happened. We don't know why it happens, but something happens in our brain when we listen to music that changes our whole perspective on life. So, if more people played music and listened to music, imagine what the world would be like.
I just can't help but believe it would be so much
So much
better.
better. The ancient Greeks had this feeling that music was the most powerful thing to study. Some of them said mathematics and music, that's what you needed to study
And both
for
are
they're both
they're
very
intertwined, yeah.
intertwined. And they thought music was so powerful that some of the greatest minds in ancient Greece would say, well, they can't listen to the Dorian mode too much when they're a young person because that might it might make them a little bit melancholy. So we have to be careful what they listen to, how much of this is like saying, don't listen to too much C major, but make sure you mix in a little bit of B minor in there.
Healthy
So
diet.
it was like music was so powerful, it would change a young person's a whole approach to life.
And
So
you're talking about one scale degree of difference,
I
right? A
know.
a raised 6 or
That's right.
something can change the way
Can
you
change
feel.
the way you feel. So, but they knew that. I mean, they knew that it was powerful. We sort of lost that along the way, and it's, but we feel it. We
We
know
feel
that
it.
music changes
I think
us.
we've maybe lost it in terms of our language and ability to discuss it, but music doesn't care. It's still gonna work.
No,
It's
it still works.
magic,
Is
you
it?
know?
Well, you know this because you tell people this a lot. You don't have to study music to come to a concert. I mean, you don't have to know a thing about music to come to a concert and leave feeling exhilarated. You don't need to study. You don't need to read the program notes if you don't want to. You don't need to do anything other than be a human being.
That's right.
And your experience in that concert hall is irreplicable. I mean, no one else is having your experience. They might have something similar. They might say, "Well, I really love that second piece."
Right.
And you agree, "Yeah, that was my favorite too." But your experience is unique to you. And I
Right.
think there's something magical about that.
No, it's beautiful. It's almost an Eastern thought. You can't,
Yeah,
dip your toe in the same river twice, like, everyone's experience is unique.
it is true.
Really cool. Well, the name of this podcast is Why Music Matters, and it's a broad idea, but as we, said
Yeah,
before we were on the air, the idea is to get close to often, um, throughout, my time in the public eye, so to speak, um, if I was asked to speak somewhere, and often it would be to, um, young musicians or people considering a career in music or some form of life in music. You, the idea is give them advice. Um, but what I would often do is just pose that question: Why does music matter? Instead of like, I want practical advice on how to make it.
right.
I just feel like the place to start is like, why does this matter? Why does music matter? And then why does it matter to you? And if you start there,
Yes.
then I think you have the capacity to do something profoundly great, even whether 100 people know about it or a million. It's
You
still
you're
giving
so
something
you're so
worthwhile.
right, Jeff, and I think I see this in the most dramatic way when I work with young people, which I do a lot over the summer because there's a lots of summer festivals and young people, even if from high school on to, I would say, post-college,
Yeah,
young post-college, um, these are people who come to these situations not knowing anybody. They
Like a
come from,
Tanglewood
yeah,
or yeah.
Tanglewood or Interlaken, or there's so many of them, and I do a lot of them. And so I see, especially with the very youngest ones in Interlaken, when they're 15 or 16 years old, um, they're coming and they're a little worried. They don't know anybody. Maybe this is their first 9 weeks away in the summer, without their parents in northern Michigan,
Right.
which is might be very different for many of them. And they don't know, and I can tell that they're worried, and they're not sure, are they good enough, or they come very often from situations where they're the very best player, and then all of a sudden they're surrounded with people who all are
They're
the
all the
very
best
best players,
players. Yeah.
and they come to love that after they've realized that, wow, together we're going to sound amazing.
Totally.
It's not going to be like, we have those people and we've got to try to play louder. So
No.
no, they're going to sound amazing, and I see them realizing that other people are like them,
Mhm.
even if they're from a different country. And a lot of times in Interlaken, which is truly international, there are people who don't speak English, and I'm wondering, how will they manage, Well, I mean, right after that first rehearsal, American kids are going up to them saying, "I'll show you where the cafeteria is. You wanna eat? You wanna eat?" So somehow they're like best friends at the end, and sometimes I conduct the final concert there, and the tears
Mhm.
of, well, gratitude, but also, understanding that something has changed inside them. I mean, they've made these friends. These are friends they'll never forget, and, they've learned something about how all people are the same, and I think this is what is the most important thing about music, because music is not uh, so structured. It can be different. You can hear someone play a flute solo and say, "I never thought of it like that. That's beautiful." Or play something at a different tempo, and it's good. Or
Mhm.
your partner is showing you a different fingering, and all of a sudden the other extraneous things don't matter, that they
That's
don't
right.
speak your language, that maybe they're wearing kind of clothes that seem odd to an American kid, that, "Oh, I don't know, but I like him,"
Yeah.
and all of the unimportant things fall away, and what is important is that we love music,
Yeah.
and so we're friends. I mean, Jeff, if that could happen to across the world, I mean, would we even have any problems anymore? I mean, it just seems to me that music is a great unifier because it strips away unimportant things, and it's just is making something beautiful happen together. And I see it so strongly with these kids,
Mhm.
and the things that they learn that are go beyond music. What's really important in life.
Yeah. I think you nailed it there. Thank you, JoAnn. It's really wonderful to talk to you. Is there
Oh,
anything over the summer with the BPO that you're particularly excited about, or traveling?
well,
Anything that you
I
have planned?
yeah, I'm doing a lot of traveling again to these festivals from California to Texas
Hmm.
to all over the place in Michigan. But the BPO in the meantime is playing in like every single park in Buffalo, and that is a very fun experience for the orchestra because there are people who this is their BPO experience.
That's
They
right.
just do they may not come into Kleinhans as much as we would want them and welcome them, but but they love hearing the orchestra on a summer night, laying on a blanket maybe, or on a lawn chair and having a glass of wine, or bringing their grandchildren or their children, and not being worried if they're running around dancing or laughing. Uh, that is an incredible experience. So
And hopefully
it's
lures them into Kleinhans to
yeah,
deepen
yeah.
that experience. But either way,
Either way, and
however they come to it.
however they come to it, Kleinhans is a particularly, welcoming hall. I
Mm.
think most people have graduated in Kleinhans, they know what it's like, or they've had a dance recital in Kleinhans, and
You have never heard live sound until you've
no, I
experienced the
know,
orchestra in
I know.
Kleinhans.
But summer is really fun
Yeah,
for people
beautiful.
to hear the BPO and coming to them in their neighborhoods. So, and you mentioned something at the beginning I just wanted to mention, maybe in closing, and that you called us a people's orchestra,
Yeah.
and we are. We were formed in 1935 during the Great Depression. for one reason only, to give people work. People couldn't work. Musicians had no work. Stage crew had no work. And it was formed by the WPA to give people jobs. It wasn't a lofty board that formed them, or a millionaire or
It's very
billionaire that formed them.
practical and
It was
concerned.
very practical. And so we've always known that we belong to this city and this county and this region. That's why we were formed, to play for this region. And I think that's always kept us very close to the people. And as a result, we see the widest diversity in our audience, of age, of economic background, of personal background. Um, and I'm so glad about that. You know, other orchestras may have had a more sort of patrician creation, but I think we had the best one. I mean, we were built for Buffalo, and I think that the orchestra feels very loved by this community.
It's a beautiful, beautiful thing and a beautiful way to wrap up our conversation. JoAnn, thank you so much for
Thank you, Jeff.
spending some time with me.
Well, it's been great to have this friendship with you, and I am so happy to have been invited to talk.
Here's to 20 more years of that. Thank you.
Thank you.